Welcome to my continuing series on What Did You Do in the Cold War, Daddy? At the end of the last part, I was speaking about how we'd intercepted the Badger bombers on their simulated war exercises. And on the recovery back to base, the memories came flooding back and reminded me that this was not, in fact, my first contact with the real face of the Cold War. My memory went back 15 years and I found myself immersed in the world of support helicopters. This is part 7 and it's called The Wessex and the Inside German Border. My first tour in the Royal Air Force was quite different to the one that I found myself in at the time of the air defence. Not only the contrast between the theatre of operations from flashing at high speed over the grey, cold and tempestuous North Sea to chattering across the haze, green and browns of the rolling landscape of the North German plain. But also the machines were at opposite ends of the performance spectrum. One a helicopter and the other a jet fighter. The speed range of the Western Wessex, 0 to 120 knots, altitude from ground level up to, say, 12,000 feet. The Phantom from 150 knots, just about getting airborne speed, up to twice the speed of sound and up to 50,000 feet. The lowest we flew over the sea, about 250 feet. Every autumn, though, the needs of the Cold War beckoned in those days, and NATO responded with a major, and I mean major, war game. A game that involved huge numbers of personnel and materiel from the armed forces of the member nations. The scenario simulated an invasion by the assembled Warsaw Pact forces, then estimated to be a conservative 1 million troops permanently based in East Germany. The exercise would then consist of our Allied defence, combined Allied defence of Western Germany in the first instance, and of course Europe and the United Kingdom in the second. The NATO plan was to deter and delay any such advance for as long as possible, but the reality was that we simply did not have the numbers to contain the massive amount of Soviet forces at their disposal. And this was despite our huge and massive investment, contribution I should say, by the United States of America. Thus, all scenarios led to a doomsday conclusion, nuclear exchange. And this was the only way that the planners could see of actually stopping any Warsaw Pact advance. Mutually assured destruction, MAD for short, and it was a very real consideration in the political game of poker that was played out between East and West. From the Berlin airlift right up to the collapse of the Berlin Wall over 40 years later. However, one particular task I remember highlighted for me the serious nature of these exercises. I'd been ordered to fly to a small village somewhere in the exercise battle area, navigation using stopwatch, heading and time, and IFR. Not actually instrument flight rules, but I follow roads. I set the Wessex down at the appointed landing site. I climbed out of the cockpit where a junior army officer of equivalent rank met me and introduced himself, and he was to be my escort into the village to meet the major, who was then going to brief me on what was required of the Wessex. Later, in a very dirty and muddy Land Rover, we drove in. And on our way, I could not help but notice the great thick cables making their way along the narrow streets, and large command and control caravans lodged neatly inside the farmers' barns. The British Army, it appeared, had taken over the entire village. It had literally moved in, and a sense of reality set in, and with it a real sense of fear. A real sense of fear, because in the late 1960s, health and safety didn't exist, certainly not as far as the military were concerned. And in these major exercises, there were opposing forces, enemy forces, if you like, very real. And for all intents and purposes, they were anything but friendly. We had heard rumours that prisoners were being taken and subjected to pretty realistic interrogation procedures that makes, actually today, waterboarding look, well, not tame, but that sort of par, that sort of level. I had seen the training films on how to resist the current interrogation techniques that could be expected in the event of being captured by the Warsaw Pact. And having seen these films, I had absolutely no desire whatsoever to get caught. The whole exercise was a serious business. Jet fighters were allowed to fly low level down to 100 feet, and we in our helicopters could fly at nap of the earth, literally 0 feet, hedge hopping all the way. Low flying in a helicopter was the only way to ensure a modicum chance of survival against surface fire. Army tanks were allowed to rumble across open arable fields at will, and were only stopped from doing so when the farmers' compensation claims exceeded the authorised limits laid down by the war game planners. However, I digress a little here. Towards the end of my tour on the Wessex, I was tasked to fly from Hohne German Air Force Base to Lübeck, just to be in Hamburg. A bit of background here, but from my point of view, the then 20-year-old flying officer, who had only a small but literally a bird's eye view of the situation. The border between East and West Germany was closed, sealed off to anyone on the ground and indeed in the air. An air defence identification zone, ADIZ for short, had been set up, and further, to reduce the risk of inadvertent infringement of the border due to navigation errors, no GPS in those days, a buffer zone was set up 30 nautical miles short of the actual physical border itself. So if an unidentified contact was seen by the air defence radar or air traffic control, heading towards it, a code word would be transmitted on the emergency frequencies. It was a standing operational order that all military aircraft flying anywhere in Germany had to monitor, to listen out on the emergency frequencies. And if the message brass monkey was heard, then it was westwards ho, no questions, no delay. But in addition to that, for the support helicopter crews, there was a training requirement to undertake reconnaissance flights of the actual physical, hard, unforgiving and dangerous inside border zone. Right up and close. Part 8 follows.